Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give it a moment or so just for everyone to join us. So welcome in, settle in, and we will start very soon. Welcome everyone. It is good to have you on board. Thank you very much for joining us on this busy week, as always, for many of us. So we're here today to talk about the Biodiversity Gain Site Register. There were quite a few new things on day one with mandatory Biodiversity Net Gain, and the register was certainly one of them. It was something that was talked about beforehand, and the Natural England team were very kindly sharing what the register would be. But on day one, that's when we actually saw the register. So we're going to go into today the ins and outs of the register, the purpose, the roles and responsibilities of all those involved, and you're going to get a little tour of what the register actually looks like. So joining me today, Tim, if you'd like to go on to the next slide and introduce yourself.
Hi everybody, my name's Tim Morrissey. I am the Principal Officer in Biodiversity Net Gain Services in Natural England. So I coordinate and oversee our register services, so gain site registrations, allocations, and also, we won't get into this today, but we also run the statutory credit sales service as well, which is a kind of separate operation sitting in the same team. I've been on the BNG project in total about 2 years now. I joined as a senior advisor in the digital build, and then moved to principal advisor when we kind of implemented it as part of national operations. So I've been very closely involved in our kind of regulatory function up until this point. So that's kind of where I'm coming from in terms of BNG. Prior to joining Natural England, I worked in natural resource policy and land management in the state of Victoria in Australia for over a decade, and did a few years as a postdoctoral researcher at the Stockholm Environment Institute before that. So my background is in environmental science and policy.
Tim, thank you. It's certainly good to have you on board today. So everyone on the call, I hope you know the drill by now. Please ask your questions. We really want to make this as useful as possible. So there's a Q&A function. We've got a team behind the scenes who are going to be sending links through for any questions that you have and answering them. If we have time at the end, we'll certainly get to your questions. So please do ask them. And as always, my thanks to the team at SciAIM for hosting us. Okay, let's get started. Next slide, please, Tim. So we're not going to go into the details of mandatory net gain. SciAIM, IEMA and CIRIA have just published a joint technical guide. We wanted it to be quite short, so the link is on the slides there when you get them, and it's also on their websites as well. So if you want the full picture of mandatory net gain, by all means go into the guide. What we're going to do is just touch on the element of mandatory net gain that really relates to the register, and then we're going to dive into the register. So Tim, next slide, please. Part of mandatory net gain is what's called the biodiversity gain hierarchy. Now, this is the guidance on the government, and it's a material consideration for local planning authorities when they're reviewing a developer's biodiversity gain plan. So what that means for us in terms of the development side, our job is to clearly set out, justify and demonstrate our application of the biodiversity gain hierarchy, and do that as early as possible. You know, it's like answering the exam questions. The local planning authorities will be looking for this information. So it's about demonstrating that really clearly as early as on, certainly at the planning application stage. So there is the text there, but if you go on to the next slide, Tim, the biodiversity gain hierarchy is a series of steps. We start off with avoiding and reducing clearance of actually loss and clearance as well, loss and deterioration of those very high and medium distinctiveness habitats in the metric. And then we achieve net gain by following a series of steps. Now, again, this is a material consideration. So you take each step in terms and you justify and explain as you move through the hierarchy. So enhancing habitats on site before you look to creating habitats on site for BNG. Local offset provision, which is going to be the one that we're going to talk about today, because that's related to the biodiversity gain hierarchy. And as a very, very last resort, let's not do this. There's those last resort statutory credits, but let's come back to that local offset provision about B&G. So Tim, next slide, please. Okay, local offset provision. Now, people might have heard about the Biodiversity Gain Site Register. So before we kind of go into the ins and outs and the details, can we start off with, what is it? What exactly is the register?
And that's a throw to me, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so thanks, Julia. That was a really good, succinct introduction. And I think this is one question we field a lot, and it's really important to kind of emphasise where we sit in the wider B&G process. We're not the whole thing. We're one small element. So that was a really good lead in. So fundamentally, where we sit is in that offsite provision space. There's a requirement in the Environment Act that developers who have been directed to secure some kind of offsite provision of biodiversity net gain have to record that on the Biodiversity Gain Site Register. And so the purpose of the register itself, the full name is the Biodiversity Gain Site Register. I will refer to it as the register throughout, but there are numerous registers, but this one's ours, is fundamentally to provide evidence, the recording of offsite biodiversity gains. We ensure that those gain sites that are used for offsite gains meet specific criteria, and we safeguard against double counting. So there shouldn't be a situation where a kind of an unscrupulous actor in the system kind of is selling units to multiple developers without intention of delivering them. The register is explicitly to prevent that. So you have to record your gain site and record how it is providing offsite units to developments. And the register, as per the Environment Act, has to be public, and that is kind of to help with transparency and public trust in the system. So fundamentally, it's a list of biodiversity gain sites and information about those sites. So it displays certain elements like location and habitat baseline and kind of created or enhanced. And part of that site information is the extent to which that habitat is being used to provide units to developments. I think it's important to emphasize at this point, and I'll say this a few times, it's a list of gain sites. It isn't a list of developments and how they are meeting their B&G requirements. So if, for example, a developer had been directed by their LPA or was able to deliver 100% of their biodiversity net gain obligation on site, they wouldn't be on the register. If they had a combination of on-site and statutory credits, they wouldn't be on the register. So there is no function to look up developments and see how they're delivering their total 10% B&G. It's a list of gain sites and the extent to which they're allocated to those developments. So there's a bit of B&G there that the register doesn't play into. So kind of think it's important to be aware of what it is and what it is not. But finally, just in terms of planning decisions on the end there, the purpose is very much that the presence of an allocation on the register is proof to your approving authority that you have met your planning permission conditions, and that is the proof you will use in your final game plan, which they will approve to then start your build. So we're kind of B&G in total is a kind of policy for developers to deliver biodiversity net gain. The register itself is almost a service for landowners to ensure that they're meeting their obligations, and we'll get into what we check and how we deliver it as we go through. So
I guess then the next question is, yeah, we've got the register, and thank you for explaining that, and then we'll go through the details. But could you talk us through the roles and responsibilities of everyone involved in the register? And I think it's quite interesting to look at everyone involved and what their roles and responsibilities are.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of Natural England, its role as a register operator doesn't have any role in assessing things like game plan or biodiversity outcomes, but it does have, there we go. So Natural England's role. So Natural England, and this is important to, again, just distinguish between Natural England, the entire entity, which has many, many functions, and Natural England as specifically the register operator. So there are regulations that were introduced, came into power in January this year, just ahead of mandatory net gain, which are subordinate to the Environment Act, in which Natural England is specifically named as the Biodiversity Gain Site Register operator, which means that Natural England is responsible for establishing and maintaining the register and making sure that everything that goes on the register is correct and genuine to the best of our abilities. So what we do is we process, if you have to apply to the register to either register a site or record any form of allocation from that site to a development, we process those applications, we verify that they're true, and we ensure that gain sites meet certain eligibility criteria, which I'll go into in a minute. And as I said before, safeguard against double counting. So double selling, so you can't multiple sell your allocations. We also, under those acts, have some powers to issue penalties if an application is found to be fraudulent. And that is specifically around the application itself, not around the delivery of BNG outcomes. So what we don't have oversight for is assessing the content of habitat management monitoring plans, or whether or not the metric is correct, or whether or not the actions are appropriate. Those are jobs for other bodies, but when you can, by the time you've come to register operator service, you should have all your securing instruments in place. You should have legal obligations, and if at that point any of that application is found to be fraudulent, then we do have some powers to issue financial penalties.
I think that's a really interesting point, isn't it? So you're the operator of the register.
Yep.
And there is an interesting and important distinction between those looking at the habitat management and monitoring plan from an ecological perspective.
Yep.
But as an operator of the register, you're looking at, well, is the legal agreement, or you're looking at is that person meeting the criteria to go on the register? So that's very much your role, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I've got some slides kind of really going into some maybe too much detail on that.
No,
just at a very high level, we are primarily concerned that a site meets BNG criteria, and that includes being secured correctly, but we don't have any oversight or powers to enforce ecological outcomes or management on the ground.
Okay, so we'll cover who does do that.
Yeah.
I just have to say, I didn't realise you had opening hours. I love that.
Oh yes. So I was going to flag this towards the end as well. We have a fantastic customer support team. So this is specifically about application queries, but we cover a lot of we kind of direct a lot of queries about BNG in general, whether or not they go to our colleagues in DEFRA, or if they're about the metric, they go to our metric colleagues. But we field all of those. You can call us up, and we have specific hours, or you can email us, and we will endeavour to get you a comprehensive response within 10 days.
Just say I've used the service, and shout out to the team. They're always really respond really lovely, and so it's definitely one to. I didn't realise you had a phone number.
Oh yeah, no, we don't get many phone calls actually. It is available on the website. People mostly contact us via email, which I think is more kind of a bit more formal for everyone involved, but we take phone calls as well, and the team are very impressive and very kind of good at processing the queries.
Okay, so we've got Natural England's role, operator, register. Yeah. What's next?
So this is Natural England specifically as the register operator. I'm aware there are. We Natural England has organised many functions. This is ours. This is the one that I kind of oversee. So local planning authorities are really the kind of the controllers of the planning processes itself. So here we go. Yeah. So it's the local planning authority's job to assess planning applications by development, have those conversations about how 10% net gain will be delivered. Is it on site? Is it through avoidance? Is it, at what point do you go to offsite provision? So it's their job to kind of, they oversee that. They will review the habitat surveys, kind of, they have to ensure the correct licenses of land managers. Again, it's their job to, as Julia really went through, enforce or kind of apply the biodiversity gain hierarchy. So essentially, by the time someone, a gain site or a developer to allocate comes to the register service, there should have been multiple conversations with a local planning authority about the nature of their planning application, and also afterwards, if it's on site or if it's been secured with the Section 106 planning agreement, then the LPA also has some monitoring and enforcement responsibilities as well. So they will be one of the bodies who are potentially making sure that those outcomes are delivered in the long term and the management monitoring is actually being carried out as per the securing agreement. So if it's on site, that would be a Section 106 planning obligation for significant enhancements. I'll just go to the next slide because, so that's kind of same thing again, habitat surveys. But for local planning authorities also potentially have a role in terms of the securing gain sites as well. So there are two mechanisms by which you can have to secure a gain site for use in B&G. It can either be a conservation covenant, and I'm sure you've had some sessions on those, or a Section 106 planning obligation in agreement with your local planning authority. And it is possible, although potentially not widely known, that planning authorities can do standalone obligations in agreement between themselves and the landowners to manage and maintain and undertake the works, and then manage and maintain for a minimum of 30 years. So as well as kind of being the gatekeeper of the planning process itself, there is possibly an opportunity for LPAs to kind of do the monitoring for gain sites for offsite provision as well. And so they will oversee that too, potentially. The other option is responsible bodies. So a gain site owner can enter into a conservation covenant with a responsible body who will be, as we kind of envision it, responsible for that offsite enforcement and oversight. So the conservation covenant or the Section 106 planning obligation must have some obligations for someone to be named as undertaking the enhancement works and then maintaining and monitoring those enhancement works for a period of minimum 30 years. And this is where the responsible bodies or LPAs, if they're taking on that through the planning obligations, will really kind of have their work to do, and that's just what they oversee. And so there's very much a separation between habitat management monitoring plans. Is the metric correct? Is this site being managed properly? What are the outcomes? Are they being delivered? If they're not being delivered, what are the penalties? All sit with the responsible body or potentially LPA. And it's very much a deliberate decision that the Register Operator Service does not mark their homework, essentially. We make sure those obligations are in place and they've done their correct paperwork, but we don't sit over their shoulder and we don't double guess whether or not they've done that correctly, because that's another stage in the planning process and we don't want to have to go back and contradict them. So the responsibility for on-site site delivery, either off-site or on-site, sits with those enforcement bodies. And finally, I've just put this in because I think this might encompass quite a few people on this call, which is the concept of the competent person, which gets named quite a lot. So the expectation is that a landowner, even for an off-site gain site without any kind of allocation, will have to submit their biodiversity metric. They will have to have kind of assessed their baseline, the size, type and condition of the habitat, and then made some projections about what the projected size, type and condition of the habitat is after whatever enhancement works have been secured by the legal agreement. And they have to use the biodiversity metric for that, using the offsite tabs. And so the expectation is still that will be undertaken by a competent person as it's defined by the guidance. So there's no formal kind of qualification for that, as I understand it. But I think this institute is kind of involved in a lot of training around that and working with our metric team. So essentially, when the metric comes to us, we take it on faith that it's been done by a competent person, and we take that information out, and that's what informs what goes onto the register in terms of the site. So we will still need, even if you're not a developer, if you want to register a gain site, a competent person will still have to kind of use the biodiversity metric to assess the condition of the site now and the condition of the site as projected using those off-site tabs, and that's what we use to register the site itself.
And thank you for explaining that, because I think it's really important. So the register operator team, and you're absolutely right, Natural England do so many things, but we're talking about the register operator.
Yeah.
And you're okay, does this person meet the criteria to be on the register? Then there's the B&G review, if you like, the ecological outcomes of biodiversity net gain. And that is the responsibility of industry to meet the competency requirements. And ultimately for the adding to the to-do list of local planning authorities. That's quite interesting. So if something's on the register, it still needs that Biodiversity Net Gain review, just to make sure that, you know, it's not just there's a link between the biodiversity net gain need of the developer and then what the offsite is actually providing.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's still kind of a lot of work going on the ground, and the register is just to make sure they've confidence that they've kind of set their legal instruments up correctly. I probably should just, oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Oh, I was just flag as well. I think it was on the slide, but Natural England have been accredited as a responsible body for conservation covenants. Natural England as an organisation will not be entering into conservation covenants for BNG because of the obvious potential conflict of interest reasons.
Yeah, they've got enough to do, to be honest.
Yeah,
Anyway,
okay.
Okay.
So conservation covenants cover a multitude of potential things you could secure, of which biodiversity net gain is one. So when we come to kind of checking those conservation covenants, there are specific BNG requirements, which is the next section, I think. So
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to start off with offset providers. Normally we started with the development side, but obviously this is a register. So for offset providers, if anyone's listening and everyone's thinking, okay, I get your role as the register operator, I get that it will be reviewed by the local planning authority, where do they start?
So fundamentally, I think I will start with the register, but where you start is a long time before you come to the register, actually. The way the service itself is constructed is that, as I've just said, our expectation is that when you come to register a site, you will have a conservation covenant or Section 106 planning obligation in place, and will have done all that paperwork, and will have done your habitat management monitoring plans, and will have done your on-site assessments and completed your metrics, all of which you will have done in negotiation with your responsible bodies or local planning authorities, or both. And you may even, as a provider, have had some provisional conversations with a developer looking to purchase your units. You don't have to, but it seems logical that a lot of people will wait until they kind of put what is potentially a fairly substantial outlay in terms of on-site works and kind of getting all your legal instruments in place and making sure you've got your kind of payments in place to your responsible body, or how you're going to do that over the course of 30 years. You would want to have a buyer lined up to make sure you're not taking a huge risk. So that is all different webinars, I believe, and that's kind of by the time you come to us, where you start with the register, you must have your legal agreement in place, and you must have done all the paperwork and kind of have your metric and everything ready to go, to which we will then kind of assess in terms of, have you secured this correctly? So I won't go into that, but what I will say is the first thing you have to do for the register is create a YouGov government gateway account, so you can actually sign in and access the service. And I'm aware anecdotally that I think this is where a lot of people stop. So you can't come in and kind of have a look at the application process itself. So I do have, depending on time, quite a lot of slides to run through if people are interested on how that looks on the other side of this government gateway. And you get to this, you can search kind of BNG delivery or Biodiversity Gain Site Register. It will take you to the guidance, and the guidance will take you to our service, or you can kind of go straight there, but it's very searchable. So this is kind of the meat of the presentation, I think.
Yeah,
so
in terms of so can you take us through in terms of, okay, someone's done, like you say, the ecology surveys, the metric, they've got their legal agreement, you know, what exactly are these application checks?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll come to the allocation in a second, but as I said, the fundamental purpose of the register is registering these gain sites as defined by the Environment Act and the subordinate regulations, and that is where we put the lion's share of our effort in terms of verification. So fundamentally, a gain site must be in England, and it must have a securing legal agreement, which is a Section 106 or a conservation covenant. Explicitly, it's got to secure enhancement works which are maintained and monitored for a minimum period of 30 years, and the legal agreement has to make it clear that site is available to be allocated to help a development deliver its net gain obligations through offsite provision. And when I say securing the enhancement works, there needs to be names, like a person who's on the hook for delivering the works and a person who's on the hook for delivering maintenance and monitoring. That is probably going to be a landowner. You can subcontract, that's fine. You can be an organisation if you're a landowner, but fundamentally you have to have an interest in the land that you can enter into this agreement, and if things go wrong, you're the person the responsible body will kind of come to and say, why isn't this being delivered? So and I'll just say a little bit about definition of site at this point as well in relation to the legal agreement, because we get quite a lot of questions on this. So I'm talking about gain sites, which could cover a multitude of parcels or subunits or kind of parcel up. When we, within the context of the regulations, talk about gain sites, what we mean specifically is the land that is bound by your legal agreement, the concord of Section 106. And if you have, so how you define that boundary and how you define what's in it is really a question for you and your responsible body, or you, the landowner, the gain site provider, and your responsible body or LPA. It is legally possible, and we can technically accommodate multiple parcels within a single agreement. We would look at the whole thing in a unified way, and if a legal agreement is sound, that's okay, and that's your site. If you have a large site, you should want to parcel up into smaller, separate legal agreements. You can do that, and it really depends how, from a financial risk point of view and provision point of view, how you as a landowner want to organise that, and where you're to whom you're selling your units. So you can put multiple parcels, geographically separate. They don't have to be contiguous particularly, and you can allocate those to sub-allocate those to developments as needed, as sold. All of a site can be allocated at once, or it can be done in smaller parts. And what we're seeing very early days of the register is relatively large sites in the order 20 to 50 hectares, allocating small parts of their habitat to specific developments, and we're expecting those to kind of fill up as time goes on.
Because that's interesting. So people, they apply to register the site, and then they just allocate.
Yep.
As it comes on. I guess the advantage is that, you know, they're on the register. There's still a bit of like, how do we find an offset provider?
You're on the register, so there's you've got assurance that the site is valid. They've done everything they need to do. A developer can just come in and purchase units as needed, depending on how they negotiate that.
And it still needs to go through the LPA check, but from a criteria point of view, it's on the register.
It's there. But that does also raise an interesting point, and I'll say this as well. The site itself, it isn't compulsory to add an unallocated site to the register. So you, as a B&G provider, you can have done all of your legal stuff. You've got an agreement with your responsible body. You've got everything in place. You could even have started the works. You don't need to come to the register until there is an allocation. So the law is that allocated sites have to be on the register. So we strongly encourage anyone to come and get themselves on the register as a way of kind of like giving developers some assurance. But you only have to come to us at the time of making your first allocation, be it all or part of the site. So it must be added at that point. So that's kind of the high level stuff. But what I will do is just kind of go through the points here. So what we check is, in terms of a legal agreement, you've got to have you, the landowner, the B&G provider, has got to have sufficient interest in that land. So in order for the CONCOV or Section 106 to be executed properly, it needs to be between landowners or leaseholders, which is a bit like a CONCOV, it's, it's a slight more conditions. So we'll need to see proof of land ownership from everyone associated with the legal agreement. And specifically, I apologise, specifically, the applicant must be one of those people as well. And when I say applicant, that is the person who is kind of on the hook if you're found to be fraudulent. That's the person who gets all the notices. We need some document. Register has to show location of the land and the boundary, so we need a bit of documentation just showing where it is. We don't have any geospatial features at the moment, so it really is just we need a good reference and an image of the boundary itself. A completed biodiversity metric. the register must show the size, type and condition baseline and projected of the habitats, and we extract those directly from the statutory metric tool. Habitat management and monitoring plan, specifically as it is linked to your legal agreement. So at any point, if a habitat management and monitoring plan is referenced in the legal agreement but is not included as an annex, we'll need that as well as a kind of the complete legal agreement. And the conservation covenant or planning obligation itself, which we also check for a whole range of things, which I'm going to run through now. So in terms of the agreement itself, like I say, we have to ensure, and we do have people reading them, that it meets specifically the criteria for biodiversity net gain as set out in the regulations. So the land must be in England, there must be an obligation to create enhancement works, and there must be an obligation to maintain those for a minimum of 30 years, and the agreement must make it explicit that this is for the purpose of allocating these to development for biodiversity net gain as well. So that is all stuff that we check. So it's really kind of it gets a bit legal, but it's essentially you've got to, and also the stuff in the legal agreement matches what's in the metric as well. So we don't assess the metric itself, we don't check the HMMP, but if they are for very obviously different things or different sites, then obviously that gets knocked back. What happens after you apply? So that says 28 days. I apologize. It should say 6 weeks. So we aim to move quicker than that, but our kind of service target for processing applications to register sites is 6 weeks. It costs £639, which is a fee that's set by legislation, and it's higher than some of the other applications simply because we have a very dedicated and talented team of operators who are opening your legal agreements and reading them. If you are assuming, so once we've verified all those points, we accept it. You obviously get a notification of that, and you get a unique biodiversity gain site reference number, which is something you would use to identify. It will go onto the register as a unique identifier, and it's something you'd use in future communications as well. The regs themselves are quite prescriptive, so we have numerous grounds to reject applications that are kind of missing things, or they're not right, or the legal agreement isn't correct. We're aware that this is part of a larger planning process. The fees are relatively high for this kind of work. We have the ability and the kind of institutional intent to work with applicants to make sure their applications are correct. So if a document is missing or it's not quite the right one, which we get a little bit of, you'll get an email and you'll be asked to kind of provide the things. And even if we think the legal agreement isn't right, we can work with the applicant to kind of make those amendments without rejecting that application and kind of having to submit £639 for a new application. So we do have an intent to make life easy for people working within relatively prescriptive regs. And finally, any decision we make can be appealed. So if it goes as far as rejecting an application, you can appeal that through the General Regulatory Council of the First Tier Tribunal. That's direct to them. We don't process those appeals, but the right does exist. Very briefly, and that is site registration. So that you can do that for an unallocated site, and that's really kind of the meat of the work for the register operator. We do also, having put a site on the register, we kind of record the allocations to developments as well. And that is essentially a slightly lighter process. You'll notice it costs £45 because there's kind of less work at the back end to do, although there is a bit. But primarily what we're interested in is who the applicant is. Unlike the site registration, an applicant can be a landowner or it can be a developer. This is the expectation that as a B&G provider, you've sold your units to a developer, you might want them to manage the process of recording. However, allocating process like this limits future use of the land. kind of having people record use of land they don't own kind of slightly contravenes Human Rights Act, things like that. So if you are a developer managing the process on behalf of a landowner, we do need to see explicit consent that the landowners are aware of this allocation. We don't ask for commercial sale documents. There's a separate form that says, here are the landowners, and here's their explicit consent to this allocation. And the other thing obviously we do is check that the habitat available in the site is actually available to be allocated. That is really one of the core purposes of the register, to make sure there's no double selling. And this is, I'll just say briefly, I'm aware people sell units, but as people on this call will no doubt be aware, the biodiversity metric itself has a spatial risk multiplier. So hectares don't lead to a standard number of units. So when you see allocations on the register, there will be a number of units that have been generated to a particular development, but that gets related back to the number of hectares that are available on the site. So when we check available habitat on the site for a particular allocation, we look at the available area of those particular habitats and make sure there is enough. And that's why we display hectares of habitat as well as units when it comes to allocations. Happy to go into that in a bit more detail if people are interested.
No, I think that's really important. So there's a register of the site, and it's really important for people to understand. We'll come at the end, this timing. So there's the register of the site, then there's the allocation of units to specific developers, and when you allocate your unit, it is that point at the bottom there. So you can do a matching process, but the development has to be granted planning permission. Then £45, that's the allocation of units. And at the end of it, for those on the call working for developers, you need the allocation in the biodiversity gain plan, but we'll come to those timings.
Yeah, absolutely. So the developer must have planning permission as well, like you've just said. That's the last piece. And I will just note that it is possible to get an allocation to a development that has its planning permission issued before mandatory net gain. Obviously, that's not what it's for, but it is possible to do it, and some people have asked about that. So we can accommodate that. I would just let people know that the system was built for mandatory net gain. So if you're using an older version of the metric, we will struggle to process it.
Okay, let's move on.
Sorry, I'm running long here.
No,
I apologise.
Great, let's go for it.
So here's the register itself. But this is available online. Anyone can go look at this. But essentially, this is, so having been through all of that, the site will then end up on the public register. It's pretty Spartan at this point, I will acknowledge that. It meets our regulatory requirements on what we have to display, but obviously in terms of usability, that's very much front of mind for us in future. But search the register. You can search by a number of search terms. Pro tip here, if you just want to browse the register, you can. You just have to press that blue magnifying icon without anything in the search bar, and that will bring you everything that's on the register. And it will bring you something like this. So this is 2 results. We have more now, but that is functionally what it looks like. Again, a bit Spartan. But if you go to a site, it will show you the gain site reference number, the size of the site, the location of the site in terms of a single grid reference, and the LPA that it exists within. There will be an image of the land boundary that the landowner will have provided to us. If the enhancement work has already started, the register will show us that. If it's at some point in the future, obviously we can't know that, so we don't show it. And also the end date of the obligations. So that is kind of essentially intended to give confidence that this site is secured for a minimum of 30 years for biodiversity net gain. Again, then that field might be blank if the end of date is contingent on works that are contingent on something else. We have no way of verifying that. So at the moment, that will just be a blank space. It will show you the habitat information in terms of baseline and projected, size, type, and condition. That's defined by dedicated by the regs. If there is an allocation, it will show you the development to which it is allocated, the local planning authority, and the planning reference number. So there should be a track back to finding that with their local LPA. This value, so this is the biodiversity units as defined by the statutory metric, and then also it will show you in terms of area and size, type, and condition of the actual allocated habitat.
Gosh, I mean, the level of detail is extraordinary. So
Well,
that's the target condition, I take it.
yes, yeah. So it'll show
Yeah,
you,
got you.
yeah, as it's kind of the habitat that has been allocated and the units it's generating. I just, for clarity, reiterate, there's no geospatial element to this at the moment. So you can't say if half a enhancement area is allocated to a particular development, you can't say it's the north half or the south half or a particular bit. It is just a notional 50% of that available habitat. We don't have the ability within the metric or the register processing to kind of map to that level. So, but we can know when all of it's been allocated. And at that point, we would not accept any further allocations to that site, and any application like that would be rejected. So the Gain Site registration journey, I'm aware of time, so I'm going to skip through a lot of this, but this is what's on the other side of that government gateway. And really, I suppose the meat of it is, before you apply, these are the things you will need. These are the things we look at. So title deeds or lease agreements prove that you have ownership or interest in the land, as it's termed legally. Written authorization. So the applicant must be a landowner for site registration, but as a general principle for any service, that person can appoint a consultant or someone to run that on their behalf. But they remain the formal applicant. So that's really just kind of, if we get Biotron Consulting logging in and the government gateway doesn't match the applicant, or the email doesn't really seem to match the applicant details, then we know that they've appointed an agent to just run that application on their behalf. That particular landowner or leaseholder would still remain the named applicant for notices and enforcement purposes should they be needed. We ask for a document showing the land boundary. We ask for the legal agreement itself, the completed statutory biodiversity metric tool, and that is essentially the source of all that habitat information that goes straight onto the register. Habitat management monitoring plan, should it be separate to the agreement itself, and a local land charge search certificate. So conservation covenant or a section 106 is a local land charge and must be registered on that register as well. And that, as per the regs, people need to prove that they've done that. And that is one of the, again, pieces of assurance that shows they've kind of really put that in place, and this is an actual charge on the land. So that must be obtained from your local land charge certificate, and we need to see a copy. And then, so this is kind of how you'll be asked to click through, and you recognise this from many other gov.uk websites. So at each point you click in and you provide particular information about the applicant and stuff you type into the form. I'll just pause on this screen here, because as well as the document list you've just seen, you will be asked to input particular elements about the land which go onto the register directly into the form. So a grid reference for land, the size of the site, an image, a PDF of the boundary. So this is all, as well as the documents you have to upload, this is kind of, it is an online form. There are things you would put in there. You'll be asked to check the baseline habitat information as you upload your metric, and it will read it back to you, so you can check that's all correct. This is the projected outline, and every point you can save and continue and come back to this. It will ask for information on your legal agreement, and this is the point at which you would put in your enhanced work start date and your end date of obligations, essentially the end of the obligation to do BNG. So that's all, you would input that directly. You would have to upload your documents, and then I apologize for the resolution on this slide. You'll get a confirmation that your application has been submitted. You get an application reference number, which is what you would use to contact the service during our determination period. So that's not your Biodiversity Gain Site number. They are separate things. This is reference specifically to the application. So this is confirmation that we've received the application, and you should receive confirmation within 6 weeks of either, hopefully we've accepted it and it's going onto the register, or we wouldn't reject at this stage, but if there was something amiss with documentation, or you'd uploaded something wrong, or we didn't think the BNG criteria were being met within the legal agreement, you would receive an email asking you for clarification and possibly new documents. And you would have 3 months to respond to that, at which point we can reject it, but as I say, our intent is very much not to be rejecting applications. Similar for the Gain Site, for the allocation journey. you'll be asked to kind of provide some information. It's very much a smaller subset. We need to know who the applicant is, and we would need a planning decision notice and details of the project itself. And this is the point at which, if this was already on the register, you would provide the gain site number. I will skip past these because they are, but you would put in your LPA planning reference number so we can identify development itself. And you would need to provide a planning decision notice at this point. So like we say, the expected order of operations is that the LPA issues a planning approval conditional with a whole range of conditions, one of which will be BNG provision. You would go away, secure those units as a developer. Having made that arrangement with the landowner, you would record it on the register, and the register itself is proof that you have discharged that condition, and that is what would go into your gain plan. So I think, yeah, here we go. So this is your application submitted page.
And I think that's the key point.
What developers know, I knew the question was on there. So it's not this page. You would get an email directly from the service that says, we have accepted your allocation record, and it will appear on the register. And so the presence on the register is proof to your LPA that you have discharged that condition for provision of offsite units.
And firstly, Tim, thank you. I try to go on the register, but it's like, well, I can't because, you want to have a look, but until you're actually allocating yourself. So thank you. We'll certainly make sure that, that information, that whistle stop tour is really helpful. Can you actually go back? I just want to, no, that's fine. I just want to, one more, this one. So it's that chain of command that I'm certainly, getting to grips with. So the development gets the planning permission, and all of this, all of this is pointing to think about biodiversity net gain as early as possible. I mean, it's just all pointing upstream. But when the developer has the planning permission, that's what the offset provider needs to allocate their units. So they need the permission. They then allocate the units, £45. You aim to respond within 6 weeks. They get the allocation. Is it a reference number? So
it will be recorded. It'll be linked to it. So there's a gain site reference number, and the allocation is information that is attached to that gain site. So the record on the register is the gain site.
Right.
And then there will be a number of developments which are allocated to that site, which will be recorded on the register as well. So in a perfect world, the developer in their gain plan would just kind of direct the LPA to look at the register. And there it is.
Okay.
There's their development. It's got their planning reference number. They know they've issued planning approval. It's all recorded there in terms of hectares and units. It should match up with the requirement as set by the LPA, and they can tick off on that planning condition.
So but for the developer, I've got my planning application. I mean, they just want to start works. So they know they've got to submit the biodiversity gain plan as quickly as possible. They need the allocation of units. So you talked about the two-step process. There's a register of the site, but the developer must have those units allocated on the register to put that information in the biodiversity gain plan. To submit the biodiversity gain plan, the LPA has 8 weeks to review the biodiversity gain plan.
Yes, and having done so, they should then be able to approve it, and work can start. So, and again, this is kind of, I hesitate to talk about the planning process. I'm not an expert on it, but I think the fundamental message is you should be talking about this with your LPA as soon as possible. It's indicated in the guidance as well. You would go in with your planning application with a kind of biodiversity gain statement, if you like, and ideally you would have had multiple conversations with your planning officer about what you're expecting to put into your gain plan, because ultimately that will be a condition of the approval. So it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that having been issued a conditional approval, you've got to find 50 units off-site because you've demonstrated you can't do it on-site. And really, I think a lot of it comes down to how the LPA want to enforce their biodiversity gain hierarchy as well. So one of the things we're kind of uncertain of the register end is how we will see this come through. Probably hinges a bit on the extent to which an LPA has the capacity or the desire to force developers to do everything on-site or on-site enhancement or avoidance, or their attitude to off-site provision will probably drive the demand for units, which we will then see come through and end up on the register.
It's an important and interesting discussion. I'm glad you raised that point, because ultimately what's makes business sense is to think about biodiversity net gain early, given all these timescales, I mean, can you imagine, are you on the register yet? Are you allocated yet? I mean, all of those conversations. And the offset provider is like, I need your planning permission, please, while we're getting to grips with all of this. So think about this early. But when you think about this early, Tim, you're absolutely right. We still follow the biodiversity gain hierarchy. It's not about, actually, you know what, we'll just start with the offset discussion early. No. Follow that biodiversity gain hierarchy, but have early sight about truly what is feasible, what is ecologically appropriate on site before you jump to offsetting. But don't leave that conversation with offsets too late, because otherwise, you'll be like, can we go yet? And then there's all these things. And I think that's, just where we are with biodiversity net gain, with that mandatory discussion, but also having that sense of, actually, we cannot leave this too late. So thank you. I think that's really important, the timescales for both, from the developer side and also from the offset provider side, to know that I think what you're also saying is that communication between the two, in the way that working relationship between the offset provider and the developer has to be really, really close in that way while we're kind of working these things out.
Yeah, and the other thing is, if you are a developer, because what you can do, you don't have to use a site that's on the register. You can go through brokers and local marketplaces and digital marketplaces to find someone who's put the land up and said, "Oh, I'm interested in," like, someone who could be interested in carbon credits or nutrient mitigation or BNG. They want the market to come to them. That person, if in negotiating that, is going to have their legal agreement in place with the responsible body or an LPA. That's still a new process. It's a substantial upfront cost as well. So again, that's something that developers might want to be aware of, is that the market is going to respond to the demand, I suppose, but we're seeing potentially a bit of a lag in terms of those sites ending up on the register ahead of being available to be allocated. So that's something else that might play into your timescales as a developer as well, is making sure your offsite is actually properly secured.
And is this the same for small sites? So for small developers, they have the small developments, they have the small sites metric. Do they, if they need an offsite, do they still go through this process?
Yes, because small sites metric is used for on-site delivery only. If you need, small sites metric doesn't have off-site tabs, I don't think so.
No.
If you need off-site provision, you have to use the statutory metric. You have to do this. Like, from our point of view, it's the same. So that is, yeah.
So the registers for both, your main sites and in terms of the small sites as well.
Yeah, from our processing point of view, it's absolutely no different. I suspect that small site developers wouldn't go to something that's already on the register, a large gain site that is able to just sell them some units and then record the allocation. £45, it happens quite quickly because it's ready to go. So that's an assurance that you don't have to find someone to get their legal agreement in place and kind of.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, my final question, and then I know, and thank you so much to the team behind the scenes for answering questions, but we'll come to a couple. Tim, what is your advice? And I'm going to start off with your advice for LPAs, your advice, and I can help you with the developer one, but also your advice for offset providers. So for LPAs listening in, and we do have some colleagues on the call, what's your advice for them? Because they've got to still look at, if you like, the biodiversity outcomes of an offset provider. Do they keep monitoring the register? Let's start off with LPAs.
Yeah, so LPAs, I think, really just be, and I'm aware kind of LPAs have different capacities and different readiness. I think from our point of view, you be aware of where the register sits and what its role is in the broader planning process. I think, particularly, and in future, if you are responsible for monitoring offsite and it isn't being delivered, I haven't gone into it. We do have capacity for changing the register, but you have to tell us. We don't do any of that monitoring. We can't compel people to keep the register up to date. So if you are aware of a particular gain site that isn't delivering or has changed, it can be changed. We have capacity to do that, but we can't go out looking. It's something that you have to come to us with.
Yes, no, that is interesting. And I think as time goes on, that's certainly a follow-up conversation. Okay.
Mm,
Your advice for developers who are thinking, okay, there's quite a lot of time, there's quite a lot of that
mm.
to get to grips with. What's your advice for developers? And then we'll go to offset providers.
Start thinking about it early, I think, is the fundamental one. And be aware that there are multiple digital marketplaces out there for people potentially selling biodiversity units. I'm agnostic on those. I think it's great that they exist. This is a market-based solution, though. So be aware of the cost as well. I think it's kind of looking increasingly like there'll be fairly substantial upfront costs for setting up a gain site, not just in terms of doing the work, but making sure you've got your conservation covenant in place. Like, bodies charged to do that, they have to pay for the monitoring, and the monitoring is for 30 years. So when you're factoring that in, I think have some frank conversations with providers about upfront costs.
Yeah, and absolutely think early. Okay. And what's your advice for offset providers?
Offset providers, I'd please put your site on the register again. If you can, I mean, if you can set up an agreement, do so. I'm aware there are upfront costs. Talk to your LPA about setting up a standalone Section 106. Anecdotally, it's not something some LPAs have been pushing back on that. It's possible and it was expected, but it would be worth having if you can't find a responsible body, because I'm aware conservation covenants are a new mechanism and there are not many responsible bodies nationally. It's worth going to your LPA and kind of pointing to the guidance and having a discussion about them having a kind of bilateral Section 106 with you, the landowner, which is legally possible, but anecdotally some LPAs are hesitant to do.
And we've had a couple of questions about the blue site, the blue line boundary. So in planning terms,
Yeah.
the developer is proposed what's mainly on the red line boundary, but a landowner might own wider land ownership. So could you clarify the difference in terms of what goes on the register in terms of does the blue line boundary qualify? I think people are thinking slightly differently in terms of that's more
No,
of a discussion for planning, and then
yeah, that's discussion for planning. So
yeah.
fundamentally, I think that is it within the red line boundary. I think it's one for your LPA to determine whether or not that is on site or off site. So I think like on site has to be within the red line boundary. And if it is, you can secure that. You can sell some of those excess units. Really, it's is the LPA or responsible body putting this under the conservation covenant legal agreement for the provision of off-site biodiversity units. And in that respect, it kind of doesn't matter where it is, but it is separate to the planning application to development. It is literally somewhere else. It is off-site.
Yeah, and we can provide some clarification on there. There's quite an interesting discussion, but you're absolutely right. There's the proposed red line boundary for the development,
Mm-hmm.
and that is on-site B&G, and then
Yeah.
anything else. If that is used as an
And,
offset provision for that B&G, it must be on the register. It's kind of that
yeah,
simple, isn't it?
and it must be secured with the conservation covenant or planning
Or section
obligations or
section
section
106.
106. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of that's really the definition of offsite, I suppose. And if it I won't speak to where it should be in terms of the blue line boundary. That's one for the LPA, but we offsite has a very clear definition.
Tim, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate your time. Also, thank you so much for your slides. I mean, the links underneath them, just fantastic, honestly, because there are quite a few. And I love the way that you put in some helpful blogs.
Oh,
I've certainly noted the opening times and the phone call.
no,
So everyone listening in, though, the email address, the team, I really have to shout out to the B&G team who are behind that. They're always fantastic and
yeah,
just
I,
really lovely emails.
I will
Really helpful.
recognize some support team here. This is obviously everything like this is a group effort. I'm standing up talking, but some very talented people have contributed to this and made a lot of these slides. So I say thanks to the B&G team, Christian in particular. And I will also say, in terms of the inquiry support, please do contact us with queries about B&G, because it's a new service. I can't speak about the future in the pre-election period, but we are mindful of future improvements. And one thing we are doing is tracking and analysing what we get in through the customer support in terms of which sectors, what are people asking, how can we use this as a basis for improvement. So every query that comes in will A, get answered, and B, is extremely useful for us.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for you and your team for, it takes a lot of work to put these slides together and for coming on these calls. So thank you very much. Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us. We will be posting this on the YouTube channel from SAIM. So please share it with everyone you know, because this register is certainly such an important part of Biodiversity Net Gain. But from us today, Tim, thank you very much. And thank you for the SAIM team for hosting us. Thanks again.
Thank you
Cheers.
very much.